last time, we studied the Easter story from the Gospel according to Paul the Apostle, and we compared the credibility of the written testimony of Paul, and that was 1 Corinthians chapter 15, with the four Gospel writers. Thank you, Mama. I don't know what you're doing there, but that's fine. Okay.
Oh, yeah.
All right. And we studied two unique things out of Joshua chapters 9 and 10. One was the Hebrews had made a treaty with the tribe of the Amorites, the Gibeonites, because they didn't seek the counsel of the Lord. Now, were they supposed to be making treaties? No. Were they supposed to be, letting these people live and stay there? No. But they did. And once their sin had become exposed, they pretty much had dug themselves a hole that they couldn't get out of. And so the Gibeonites became servants to keep the tabernacle and the Israelites supplied with water and with wood.
So when you're talking about the Gibeonites, you're talking about the people that brought their old crusty bread and all that.
Well, you talk about put on a show to fool somebody, but they did it. And then we also covered the story where God delivered 5 sister city kingdoms to the Hebrews by use of large hailstones. And again, we talked about English translation, the predominance is hailstones, as if it's from, thunderstorms. But the Hebrew word literally means stone. So stones falling from heaven, and they were large, killed more by an act of God than was slain by the Israelites in that battle. The second important thing we studied was the fact that God kept the sun in the sky until the enemy had been completely obliterated. And, that just points up, once again, do we believe our Bible or do we not?
I don't think we talked about this, but there is a scientific, non-explained thing about that and how, I can't remember, I wish we'd looked that up, but there is a thing that shows why our calendar and the days are a certain thing, and it has that included in it. Have you ever heard of that before?
Yes, I have, and that's some of what we studied. And there are some people in the scientific community that say they can explain where our days used to be 300, our years used to be 360 days long, and over time, by interacting with a Mars planet that had a different orbit than it does now. Not to mean it like jumped,
but
it
basically
adjusted.
To jump to it, it's that the Earth would have had to have stood still for a certain amount of time for it to work out the way it has. And we can look in the Bible and see that the Earth did stand still for that amount of time.
Yeah.
In the scripture.
And in case y'all didn't know it, there's a counterpart notation in the Chinese literature from the exact same time that says they had an extra long night.
Yeah.
Now, is that not just blow
Which
you
would have
away?
been on the other side of the
Which would have been
world.
on,
So it would have been nighttime there.
it would have been
A long-
nighttime there.
long
They would have
night.
had an extra long night, where in the Holy Land they had an extra long day.
Right.
So these are the kind of things that we find when we're doing this research for this stuff. And praise the Lord's all I can say, because I don't guess, when we get to heaven, we're going to have so many questions. We're going to want to ask Jehovah God, and will we even care to have the answers by that time? I don't know, but there's so much that we still don't understand. And you have so many people say we'll turn left, and so other people say we'll turn right. And one day we're going to get to ask God, well, which way was the right way to go? And if we're in the right spot and the right frame of mind, maybe Jehovah God will tell us. Well, this week's lesson is if you keep shooting yourself in the foot, you'll soon find out you've run out of feet. And that is Invisible Things Podcast 28, April 14th, 2014. Let's see.
This is 2024, honey.
2024. 24. Look, where I was reading that from was so tiny, I thought it was 14.
I just thought you might have known what year it was.
No, I got to get up here and look good, but yeah, it's 2024. There it popped up. All right, where are we? Well, folks, we are dead center in the Holy Land. And this particular map is showing where the lands that were allotted to the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, again, you know, the Levites, they didn't get territory. What did they get? They got cities. Why? Because the Levites was the tribe of the priesthood. And so they did not get territory. So that knocks you back to I can't remember. But anyway, Joseph's two sons make up the difference.
Manasseh and
Manasseh and
gives the E.
Ephraim.
Ephraim. I can say Ephraim, but you say Ephraim. That sounds good to me.
Well, that's how the difference was made up. One son took in Joseph's place, and his brother took in place of the Levites, and that's how you got back to the 12 tribes. When are we? Well, we're still in the time period of 1406 BC to 1400 BC, a 6-year span of time. That's approximately how long it took for Joshua and Caleb to pretty much achieve the military conquest. Okay. And I use the word military for a reason, and you'll soon pick that up. This time we're going to cover the northern campaign. It got completed in Joshua chapter 11. The capital of worship and operations moved to Shiloh from Gilgal, which, if you remember, that's the very first encampment that the Hebrews had on the west side of the Jordan River. And it was right just east of Jericho. And it seemed like every time anything happened anywhere, they always went back to Gilgal to camp. And that's where the tabernacle had been set up first, and it stayed there pretty much until it was moved to Shiloh. Okay. Allotments of territory by tribes, cities for the Levites. Military conquest did not equal territorial conquest. Then Joshua dies, and then we're going to cover the implications of disobedience, the lack of faith, and whatever else we think we want to talk about as to why things didn't work out for the Israelites like God intended. Let's go back and remind ourselves of something. What did God tell Abraham back in Genesis? He said, the sins of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. That's why they stayed in Egypt for 400 years, was because in the fourth generation, your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure.
Hey, Wanda.
Hey.
Hey.
Sorry.
It's okay. There you go. She did it. She got it.
All right. Now, we know that the Amorites were like a super
What you did. I've never seen a big before.
well, because you grabbed it when I was trying to get to it.
Let me. Wait, check it. Sorry, we're trying to fix something here. Won't show but so many, so I can't.
Sorry.
Okay. Mute Mike's phone, can you, Wanda?
Grab that corner and see if
Yeah, Mike. Say it's not, there she is.
What did you say?
That's okay, we got it now, I got it.
Okay.
all righty. Anyway, the Amorites, if you remember, and the reason that symbol over there is showing that person handing that child to that statue is because the Amorites and most, and we found this out, most of the pagan tribes had devolved into child sacrifice. And that was one of the worst things that God ever said anybody could do. And he was so adamant about the fact that the Hebrews would not do it. Anyway, that's what God had told Abraham in Genesis 15 in verse 16.
We don't know for sure what the sin of the Amorites was,
No.
other than they had a lot of them, a lot of sins, of course, but we don't know for sure that it was child sacrifice. It could have been the pollution of the generations that had not,
That's a very good point. I was
Yeah.
fixing to raise the same issue.
Mhm.
Is, as we found out and we've discussed before, it's like the conditions after Genesis 6, from the point in time in Genesis 6 up to the time of the flood, what was Satan and his minions trying to do on the earth? Well, here we are, and in 400 years, it's like Satan was trying to lay a landmine in the city, in the area of Canaan, because he knew Canaan, the land of Canaan, had been promised to the Hebrews, and that's out of the land of Canaan is where the Messiah was supposed to come. Satan and his minions knew all this, so they were trying to set up the land of Canaan. It's almost like God said, give me your best shot. I'm going to give you 400 years to do it. That's what it's almost like.
but
So-
we know that there are quite a few times when the Bible talks about it will say the sin of the fathers to the 10th generation or to the such and such generation. And we never knew what that meant, but there is some indication that that could mean genealogy wise,
Mm-hmm.
that, the hybrid factor of the Raphaim or the
The
Nephilim.
Nephilim,
Mhm.
which manifested itself. We've covered that before. Several different tribes. They weren't all giants. Gigantism.
You don't have to go back over that.
Yeah.
I was just trying to say that that the sin of the Amorites has not reached its full measure could have something to do with that.
I
That's
agree.
all I was thinking.
But the reason I was bringing that up is because in the book of Joshua, we're going to see it again,
Yeah,
specifically.
okay.
And the Amorite capital in the time of Abraham was located right here in this area of Mari. This is etymologically, this is where the Amorites originated, and they expanded to the southwest. They expanded to the southeast. They expanded to the northwest. Okay. So the Amorites were a very predominant people by the time Moses had led the Hebrews out of Egypt, heading back to the promised land. The Amorites are first mentioned in the Bible in the Table of Nations, and they're descended from Canaan, one of the sons of Ham in Genesis 10:16. Amorites by name are also mentioned in extra biblical writings in Sumerian text, Egyptian text, and Akkadian text. And just so you'll know, the Akkadian language, and I'm not talking about Acadians that were the precursors to Cajuns in Louisiana. We're talking about
No,
totally separate things, so don't get them confused.
I hope.
Akkadian text is basically another kingdom that, for some reason or another, it's kind of like, when Alexander the Great was a Greek and his armies basically kicked everybody's butt from Italy over to India, up into the Western China and Saudi Arabia and down into Africa. I mean, he's just a bad dude. I don't mean he's bad morally. I just mean he just laid waste to everybody that opposed him. Well, that was 300 or 400 years before Christ. Well, by the time Christ, the time of Christ, Greek was still the predominant language. Okay, that's how strong the effects were of Alexander the Great and those that followed him from Greece on the Middle East. Well, the Akkadians were something very similar to that. Their language was easy. Their written alphabet was easy to understand, and so it became widely used. And that's and if you've never heard of the Akkadian language or culture, that's who they are. Okay, and I hadn't either, but I learned that by studying for tonight, and that's why Akkadian is a pretty common language for a lot of stuff that was around this time period. If you recall, back in Exodus, was it Numbers? Sihon and Og were independent Amorite kings that were defeated by Moses and Joshua. If you remember Og, see if I can go back up here. There we go. Og was in this area right here. There's Mount Hermon right there. And Og, his territory went down to the Sea of Galilee, around the Sea of Galilee, about halfway down to the Dead Sea. All of that right there was Og's territory. And then Sihon was the next kingdom down.
Well, what you remember about Og, or I do, was how he was a giant and how big his bed was.
Right.
And all that. And that's in the Bible.
Right. Well, and they were both independent Amorite kings.
Right.
But now let's remember what God said about the Hebrews. You had all the pagan nations. I've shown you the map. Well, I hadn't shown you the map yet. But here he says, you shall be holy to me, for I, the Lord, am holy and have separated you from the peoples that you should be mine. If you remember Deuteronomy 32, 8 and 9, he says, I've given over all the other nations. This was right after the Tower of Babel. I've given over all the other nations to other gods. But for me, I have reserved Jacob and the house of Jacob. So he's repeating it here in Leviticus 20:26. You shall be holy to me, for I, the Lord, am holy, and I have separated you from the peoples that you should be mine. So what are we looking at? What were the Hebrews facing? All right, here's what I remind you. There's Og, there's his kingdom. And in some places you'll read, see, that's Mount Hermon right there. From Mount Hermon down to the Sea of Galilee, down to about halfway between the Dead Sea and the Sea of Galilee, that's where it goes into Sihon's kingdom. And then there's the Phoenicians, Hivites, Philistia, Amorites. Now look at here.
Basically, what you're looking at is you're looking at all the nations that the Israelites are supposed to overcome and take the land.
Yes,
these are the people they are supposed to face. This
Yes.
is what they're supposed to take.
now remember this. This is Canaan proper, right here. This is Canaan proper.
So everything on this side of it is what they were supposed to take. That was the promised land.
Originally, that was the promised land.
Right.
Everything west of Jordan to the Mediterranean
It's
Sea.
no originally to it. That is the promised land.
That's-
That is the promised land.
That's a good point. That's a
Okay.
good point. The point I'm making though is, let's see what's coming up next. Well, dadgummit. Let me go back real quick.
That's okay. It's gonna,
There we go. The point I'm making is this is where it ended up. 2 tribes and half of a tribe ended up on the east side of the Jordan
we
River.
were gonna come to that. Don't
Yeah.
feel bad.
All right. This is what they were facing. If you remember, they had to go around Edom. They ended up fighting with the Moabites. I'm sorry, they didn't fight with the Moabites to start with, but there's Sihon, there's Og. Then they crossed at the Jordan River, and here's your next slide. This shows you how they entered the promised land from the east to the west. The white line shows their initial conquest of Jericho and Ai. They went up to Shechem and had the ceremony of blessings and curses. Then they came back to Gilgal. And then what happened? If you remember, the Gibeonites made a treaty with them,
The moldy bread people.
the moldy bread people. And so they had to go and protect them. And they ended up, this is the southern campaign in green. And then what's left to do is the northern campaign that we're fixed to cover next. This shows you the map of what is described in chapter 11 of Joshua. I'm going to go one slide more and then we'll go back to that map. The battle was at the waters of Merom. The kings of Hazor, Medan, Shimron, Akshaph
There you go.
led a group of lesser kings from the northern nations to battle Joshua. They were no match. God said, "Do not be afraid. I will deliver all of them slain before Israel." Joshua pursued after the battle, and they were winning. Joshua pursued them west, east, and north to Sidon's brook of Misrephoth. All were killed, but no cities were razed.
What does that mean?
That means destroyed.
Okay.
Everything torn down.
Okay. It makes
Okay.
sense.
Except Hazor, and Hazor was not destroyed by dismantling it. Hazor was destroyed by fire.
Okay.
Now let's go back to the previous slide. All right. Here they are. They've come from Gilgal up to the area of the Sea of Galilee. There's Merom. That's where the waters of Merom were. That's where the battle took place. And they pursued them, all the kings. They sent some of them east and pursued and killed. They went west to Tyre and Sidon and killed. And then they returned after they were all slain. Now here's more in chapter 11 of Joshua. And at that time, Joshua came and cut off the Anakim from the mountains, from Hebron, from Debir, from Anab, from all the mountains of Judah, and from all the mountains of Israel. Joshua utterly destroyed them with their cities. None of the Anakim were left in the land of the children of Israel. They remained only in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod. Do y'all remember who the Anakim were? Well, the very next passage talks about it. It's from the book of Numbers. And they, talking about the spies that were sent out, that Moses sent out,
The 12 spies.
Joshua and Caleb and 10 other spies went out. They went up through the south and came to Hebron, Ahiman, Shizai, and Talmai. The descendants of Anak were there. Now, Hebron was built 7 years before Zoan in Egypt. There we saw the giants. The descendants of Anak came from the giants, and we were like grasshoppers in our own sight, and so we were in their sight. So the Anakim, that's what I was saying a while ago. The Anakim is part of the Nephilim. And giantism is not the only characteristic. Some of them had the ability to see at night. Some of them made humming sounds like insects. They were just weird people. But the Anakim were known for their extraordinary height. And therefore, when you go back and read Numbers 13, when they say, we were like grasshoppers were to us, that's what we were like to them. That's how tall they were. That's how huge they were. Now, let's go back to Joshua 11:21 through 22. Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod. We're going to cover in a minute that these areas right here were, even though militarily the Israelites conquered the land, but they didn't drive everybody out. They didn't kill all those that they were supposed to have driven out. Remember, the orders were kill some, wipe them completely out, drive the others out. Well, they didn't obey very well. And you're going to find out that in these areas, that's where Goliath and his 4 brothers came from. And in a minute, you're going to find that there's some more Anakim in the north of Israel that was left in that area. In chapter 18 of Joshua, Joshua's headquarters and the tabernacle were moved from Gilgal to Shiloh. The whole assembly of the Israelites gathered at Shiloh and set up the tent of meeting there. The country was brought under their control. This was where Joshua and everybody stopped warring as a group, okay? Mainly because all the forces that could militarily come against them had been defeated. And Joshua, in just a minute, you're going to find where Joshua was told, or God told him, for each individual tribe to then go on and capture the remainder of their land, take over the cities, occupy cities you did not build, harvest from fields you did not plant. Yeah. All right. Where's Shiloh? Let's remember a few things. If you want to know where Jerusalem is, what's your good point? North end of the Dead Sea, and go immediately west. Due west from the north end of the Dead Sea will always be Jerusalem. Bethlehem's about 10 miles southwest of Jerusalem. Shiloh is about 2/3 of the way from Jerusalem and Shechem. And you remember what Shechem was. Shechem was the Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal. Okay, there's Shechem. And on that particular map, I think the only thing we've got I wanted to point out to you was Shiloh. All right. Now, in Joshua 21, God says, I fulfill my promises. And here's what he says. So the Lord gave Israel all the land he had sworn to give their ancestors, and they took possession of it and settled there. The Lord gave them rest on every side, just as he had sworn to their ancestors. Not one of their enemies withstood them. The Lord gave all their enemies into their hands. Not one of all the Lord's good promises to Israel failed. Every one was fulfilled. But Joshua gave a warning. He was at Shiloh when he said this. This is Joshua 23. You yourselves have seen everything the Lord your God has done to all these nations for your sake. It was the Lord your God who fought for you. Remember how I have allotted as an inheritance for your tribes all the land of the nations that remain, the nations I conquered between the Jordan and the Mediterranean Sea in the west. So a while ago we were talking about the promised land. The promised land was from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. The Lord your God himself will push them out for your sake. He will drive them out before you, and you will take possession of their land as the Lord your God promised you. Now look, this is Joshua 23. This is after they've won all the military campaigns. But how is God speaking here? You will. I will. Okay, it's speaking in future tense, meaning they still had work to do. Okay? They had to go and actually occupy. No army could defeat them. They've all been defeated. All they had to do was go and occupy. You're going to be astounded at what we're fixing to see here. This continues Joshua's warning in chapter 23. Be very strong, be careful to obey all that is written in the book of the law of Moses without turning aside to the right or to the left. Do not associate with these nations that remain among you. Do not invoke the names of their gods or swear by them. You must not serve them or bow down to them, but you are to hold fast to the Lord your God as you have until now. The Lord has driven out before you great and powerful nations. To this day, no one has been able to withstand you. One of you routs 1,000 because the Lord your God fights for you, just as he promised. So be very careful to love the Lord your God. Now, here you go, written in red, because I wanted to really highlight this. Still in Joshua chapter 23. But if you turn away and ally yourselves with the survivors of these nations that remain among you, and if you intermarry with them and associate with them, then you may be sure that the Lord your God will no longer drive out these nations before you. Instead, they will become snares and traps for you, whips on your backs, and thorns in your eyes until you perish from this good land which the Lord your God has given you. In the slide before, he said, do this. This slide, he says, but if you don't do this, here's what's going to happen to you. Now, this is Joshua's farewell warning. This occurs at Shechem. Now, fear the Lord and serve him with all faithfulness. Throw away the gods your ancestors worshiped beyond the Euphrates River and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. But if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, then choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your ancestors served beyond the Euphrates or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are living. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. Now, that last sentence there is a well-quoted verse. If you've been to church more than 10 times in your life, you probably heard a preacher or a Sunday school teacher or a training union teacher quote that scripture there. But now here's what I want to make a point to you of. In verse 14, talks about the gods your ancestors worshiped beyond the Euphrates River and in Egypt. This is acknowledging that the Hebrews, while they were in Egypt, after the first or second generation after Joseph passed away, they had forgotten God. They were fully enveloped in pagan worship while they were in Egypt.
If they hadn't forgotten him, they had just lumped him in with everybody else.
Yeah, they forgot who he really was.
Yes, for sure.
He was just,
Talk about, okay, you're fixing to.
all right, here's something I wanted to make a point to you. Let me go back. Throw away, the Hebrew word there is sur. Yeah, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, but that is the Hebrew word.
Where we're going with it.
Yeah. Throw away the gods your ancestors worship. Okay. When the English translation throw away is read, what do you think of? Trinkets?
I think of throwing it in
Carved
the
iron?
garbage can. Yeah.
Yeah.
Something you could just toss and throw away.
But that's not the meaning of the Hebrew word. The Hebrew word sur literally means turn away, leave, depart from, abandon, turn aside from, forsake, or reject. It's not when and I've actually heard preachers and teachers use this, throw away. They specifically were referring to the carved images. Well, the carved images weren't anything anyway.
If you didn't read this, if you didn't know the Hebrew, you might think that, but that is not what that means. That is talking about the little g gods that they were worshiping in Egypt, and their ancestors were making sacrifice to
Yes.
and praying to and all that. That those throw it away means turn away, leave, depart from,
Yes.
reject all those gods.
And
It's me. I am God.
yeah, I think this is one of those times where the English language did not translate very well, and people who did not look behind the words to go to the original Hebrew would not have gotten the
We just didn't have the capability of
no.
knowing these things when we were younger. Our parents didn't either, or
No.
the preachers that were teaching us. So
Well, and again, when you say throw away the gods, you're thinking, well, I'm gonna gather up all these blocks of wood and
like
these,
what Rachel had, like
Yeah.
her little things that she had.
that she hid in her knapsack
Which,
or
I
something.
mean, I'm sure they're supposed to do that too, if they have any, but
They were, yes,
it's not,
but in
that's
this
not the full impact of
No.
what that means.
in this warning from Joshua, he's saying, turn away from the gods your ancestor worshiped. There was no doubt in Joshua's mind that these were supernatural beings who, in limited ways, could perform miracles sometimes, just like the sorcerers and magicians back in Egypt could do to a certain extent. Joshua was saying, these are who these really are. Stay away from them. Don't worship them. Turn away from them. If you've had any inclination, don't do it. Don't do it. He's recognizing them for what they really are. All right, so here's what I want to show you. For those of you that may not be aware, if you remember, we covered this before, where as they crossed into the promised land, 2.5 tribes said, hey, we really like it over here, because they had gone up here and they had kicked this guy's butt and they had kicked this guy's butt, and they said, hey, we kind of like this land. So they were allowed to leave their
Families,
and
possessions.
possessions and stuff like that. But Moses made them promise that the warrior men of the tribes had to come and stay with the Israelites until they completed the campaign over here.
Mhm.
And then when Moses died, they obviously, had to stay loyal to Joshua. Now, there's a scripture. We didn't make a slide for it, but there was a scripture in here where Joshua said, you have done well. You performed like you promised you would. Now you're free to go back to your families. Well, where they were going was these areas here. And that's Reuben and Gad and half of Manasseh. Manasseh, by this time, was a huge tribe. And so you had half the tribe went to the west of the Jordan River and the other half stayed here. And they pretty much occupied from Mount Hermon way down into here. And then there's Gad and then there's Reuben. And here's what I want to show you about something. See Dan right here? Dan's a smaller tribe, got a little bit of space, but he did such a terrible job, which I'm going to show you in the next slide. Let me go ahead and show you the next slide. I'm showing you again. This is all they actually conquered. Okay? And they did not complete the conquest. And you're going to see
When you say conquered, you meant conquered and occupied,
conquered and occupied. That's correct. That's
Right.
correct. They conquered the armies.
because they came to the end of the campaign and Joshua even told the people they could go back across the Jordan.
Oh yeah, everything's fine.
And he said, just stay faithful to God, and gave them some instructions. And here's a story that goes with that. But
Yeah.
anyway,
All right. But now that you've seen this, this is actually what they occupied. Okay. Now let's go back one slide. Look at the difference.
that's what they were supposed to take.
This is what they were supposed to take and occupy. All right. Now, when I make the point about Dan, look at Dan on this slide and then look at Dan where Dan would have been over here. He didn't even make it to the Mediterranean Sea.
Mhm.
Well, my goodness, he wasn't very big to start with.
Yeah.
So y'all are going to find out that Dan actually left. The tribe of Dan actually left from here and went up here between Naphtali and East Manasseh. There's a town up here that they got the name of Dan. That wasn't its old name. It was named Dan simply because this tribe, lock, stock, and barrel uprooted from here because they would not go on and conquer to the Mediterranean Sea. Okay. So they left lock, stock, and barrel from down here and moved up there and occupied between Naphtali and East Manasseh. Now let's look at this again. I want to throw this out at you. want to make sure we're not running out of time.
Yeah.
There is historically, there's an argument about a couple of Egyptian pharaohs who, obviously y'all know Egypt's way down in here, okay? And they warred with the Hittites. Well, the Hittites were way up north, way up above. There's nothing on here. We can't see them. I don't have a map big enough to show you, but the Hittites were up north. And so historically, the records indicate that the Egyptians went north and the Hittites came south, and none of them mention Israel. Well, why would you find that unusual when in fact the Israelites didn't make it to the Mediterranean Sea anyway? And the route they would have taken would have been this sea road. The Egyptians going north and the Hittites coming south, they had no reason to come down through Israel.
There's no reason for the record to say, and we passed through Israel.
No,
They didn't have to pass through.
they didn't have to, but that's an argument
They
that's
should have
used.
had to, but they didn't.
And it's totally irrelevant. It's another one of those things about, the excavations of Jericho. The woman made, Kathleen Kenyon, wasn't that her name?
Yeah.
She made a supposition based on what she didn't find. Well, the so-called archaeologists and historians who can't find on a particular campaign either Egyptian going north or Hittites going south a reference to Israel, well, that's just proof right there. There was no such thing as the Israeli nation at that time. Well, it's an argument that holds no water because there was no reason for them to have made that reference. And next time you're going to find out that there is we're not even going to be through today, and you're going to see a lot of reasons to know otherwise. But next time you're going to see an instance where an Egyptian king absolutely makes reference to Israel, and he calls him by name. Calls him by name, folks. Okay. So what happened? What happened? Why did we go from this to this? What happened? They did exactly what Joshua told them would happen to them if they didn't obey. These city nations were not destroyed, nor were they occupied. That's the list of them. There are your Bible references. Okay. Toward the end of Joshua, beginning of Judges, it covers these cities. And some of these cities you're going to find out were very important in the history of Israel. As for the Jebusites, the inhabitants of Jerusalem, the children of Judah could not drive them out, but the Jebusites dwell with the children of Judah at Jerusalem to this day. That's Joshua 15:63. Now, Snar, you want to give me your note on that one?
I looked up the Jebusites, and I just asked Google, who are the Jebusites in modern day? And it said that this is what Wikipedia said. It said the politicians Yasser Arafat and Faisal Husseini, among others, have claimed that Palestinian Arabs are descended from the Jebusites in an attempt to argue that the Palestinians have a historic claim to Jerusalem that precedes the Jewish one. So they're saying that they were there before the Jews were. And you know what? In some ways, that's probably true, but they were supposed to be driven out because that's supposed to be their land.
Well, and we're going to cover that in just a
Yeah.
minute. And they did not drive out the Canaanites who dwelt in Gezer, but the Canaanites dwell among the Ephraimites to this day and have become forced laborers. And in Issachar and in Asher, Manasseh had Beth Shean and its towns, Ibleam and its towns, the inhabitants of Dor and its towns, the inhabitants of Endor and its towns, the inhabitants of Tanakh and its towns, and the inhabitants of Megiddo and its towns, 3 hilly regions. Yet the children of Manasseh could not drive out the inhabitants of those cities, but the Canaanites were determined to dwell in that land. And it happened when the children of Israel grew strong that they put the Canaanites to forced labor, but they did not utterly drive them out. So the Lord was with Judah, and they drove out the mountaineers, but they could not drive out the inhabitants of the lowland because they had chariots of iron. What would
What?
chariots of iron be to God? But that was the excuse. And they gave Hebron to Caleb, as Moses had said, but then he expelled from there the three sons of Anak. Three sons of Anak, the Anakim. What do we know about them? They were known for being huge in stature. But the children of Benjamin did not drive out the Jebusites who inhabited Jerusalem. So the Jebusites dwell with the children of Benjamin in Jerusalem to this day. That's in Judges. And it came to pass when Israel was strong that they put the Canaanites under tribute, but did not completely drive them out. Nor did Ephraim drive out the Canaanites who dwelt in Gazar, but the Canaanites dwelt in Gazar among them. Nor did Zebulun drive out the inhabitants of Kitron or the inhabitants of Nahalal. So the Canaanites dwelt among them and were put under tribute. Do you know what put under tribute means? Basically means they were indentured servants and they were taxed. They were allowed to ply their trades. If they were farmers, they were allowed to farm. If they were winemakers, they were allowed to make wine. If they were sheep herders, they were allowed to raise sheep, but they were taxed and had to pay tribute to those tribal leaders. But the worst, the sin was not that they were kept under wraps, because you're going to find out they weren't, but the fact that they didn't drive them out, they didn't occupy their cities. All right, I don't know how many of you might have heard of the Amarna letters. This is one of the more important archaeological discoveries in recent times that have to do with the conquest of Canaan and the occupying of the Holy Land by the Hebrews. And you're going to find out why. The Amarna letters, let me show you what they look like. That's what they look like. And that's what they look like. And you can compare some of these. They were smaller. Okay.
I
Some
asked
of them
Keith
are
how big they were because I said that first one looked like
the chiclet,
no, what are the wheat frosted wheat?
frosted wheat.
It looks like frosted wheat cereal, but they are bigger
Yeah.
than that evidently.
In this slide, you can see that's an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, and you can see some of those are as large, and a couple of them larger, and then some of them that are smaller. But they were large enough to read. Now, what are they? Well, let's go back. What are they? They were clay tablets on which, and it was the Akkadian language is what most of them were written in. That was the common language. That was the universal language
You talked about that earlier.
that had been adopted by people living in the land of Canaan, and that was because, like I said, it was an alphabet in a form of writing that could go across nations. Like, if you send me something in German, I might could pick out one or two words, but I wouldn't have a clue what you're saying. Well, Akkadian was that universal language, like Greek was.
You remember how in Game of Thrones they got around the fact that all these places would speak different languages and they would call it the common tongue?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
There you
Akkadian
go.
was the common tongue. Okay. They were tablet letters written in clay using the stylus and the common language. And they were written from Canaanite city nations complaining about the invading, marauding people called the Habiru, who were taking over the land of Canaan. They were written to Egyptian Pharaoh Akhenaten at his new capital at Amarna along the Nile River. That's why they're called the Amarna letters, because that's where they were discovered.
The Habiru is the Hebrew.
Well, here we go. I can tell you that references to Habiru, depending on who you talk to, it's debatable, or no, it's not debatable at all. Etymologically, there are many scholars that say Hebrew and Habiru come from the same root word, which is found way back in the book of Genesis to Heb something. There was a name back there that we studied before, but they were the etymology appears that you can take both of them back to that one word. Okay. But the Habiru is what the Canaanites call these people. Well, look, there's this guy named Mike. He's a PhD, Michael Astor. He's a non-believer. He does not believe in Jehovah God, does not believe in Jesus, he's an atheist by profession. Here's what he said about these people based on his study of all the writings that refer to them. Here's what he says about them. They were semi-nomads in the process of sedentarization, basically settling down into cities or villages, who came from the semi-desert zone and entered civilized regions as strangers. They were members of tightly knit tribal units whose allegiance was determined by kinship and who had their own system of law.
That's them.
Boy, it sure sounds like Hebrews to me.
That's them.
Okay, he's not done. He goes on to say, they acted in large armed units which were not only engaged in plundering raids, but were also seizing for themselves towns and parts of the lands under Egyptian rule. Now, let me stop there. Why would you say it's under Egyptian rule? Because that's what Canaan was. Canaan, at the time of the conquest, those Canaanite kings had been defeated by the Pharaoh who preceded the Pharaoh of the Exodus. And so these kings were allowed to stay in place and rule their own places, but they all had to pay tribute to Egypt. And so even though this is
It's also why they had a free pass to get up to the Hittites.
exactly,
Yeah,
because as long as they stayed in Canaanite territory, nobody's going to mess with them.
right.
Because the Canaanite kings were alleged, first of all, to themselves. Second of all, they were alleged to Egypt.
Right.
Okay. And so it made perfect sense when these kings of these cities were under siege and onslaught by the Habiru that they would appeal to Egypt to come help them. Okay. They acted in large armed units which were not only engaged in plundering raids, but were also seizing for themselves towns and parts of the lands under Egyptian rule. History shows that whenever one finds independent armed bands, these were always ethnically homogenous. Now, the trade name Habiru basically means marauding people. Okay, but if you were thinking in terms of bandits,
That would be every nationality and nation you could think of.
that had been
because
kicked out of wherever they came
the
from.
crooks all got together and banded together.
Exactly. But that's not what
But
his
they're
this
ethnically homogenous means they were
All
all the same
related.
ethnicity.
they were all of the same ethnicity.
Mhm.
Again, who does that sound like? Habiru
That's him.
is what he calls them. That's what they translated those Amarna letters into. It says it's Habiru. So when I say it's debatable, it's kind of like this. For the most part, most people can say that's exactly who they're talking about. And it's like you have to stretch.
To fit anybody else into that.
If you want to say that they're talking about somebody else, number one, they have no replacement people.
Who else would it have been?
Exactly. There is no other recognizable group of people that could be described this way at this point in time. Now, let's go on. The Amarna letters refer to a time approximately 20 years after Joshua's campaign of conquest ended. Again, who else could they have been talking about?
Sim.
It's interesting to note that none of the major cities captured or held by the Hebrews, such as Jericho, Ai, Bethel, Gibeon, Shiloh, Mizpah, have letters written from those cities to the Egyptian
Yeah,
Pharaoh
those weren't complaining to the Egyptian
because they
Pharaoh.
couldn't.
They weren't there or they were occupied by the Israelites.
Exactly. However, there are a number of letters from the city nations which were not destroyed, but allowed to stay within the territories of the promised land. So remember what it said, Joshua, they're going to be a thorn in your side? Well, guess what?
Yeah.
Milkilu, king of Gezer, writes, there is war against me from the mountains. Well, what was going on at this point in time? Who had the high ground?
Israelites.
Who had the high ground? Okay. They had made peace with the Gibeonites. They defeated the coalition of the 5 Amorite kings that were in the highlands, and we're fixing to show you where that is. And he goes on to say, save my land from the power of the Habiru. The war is severe. The Habiru are stronger than we. My own brother has pledged himself to the Habiru. Where are we talking about, y'all? Dead Sea. Go due west. There's Jerusalem. Where's Gezer? There's Gezer right there. That is who sent that letter to the Egyptian. Look how much closer he is to the Mediterranean Sea.
And if you remember the other picture and it shows the part, well, show the next picture. Show the next picture. That's it. That's the one. There you go. There's Israel right there in that very spot in the high ground.
Exactly.
Mhm. See?
Here's the highlands. Israel had these, but they wouldn't go into the lowlands and go on to the Mediterranean Sea. Remember, it said Gath, Ashdod, Ashkelon. Those stayed in
Gaza.
in Gaza. This is part of Gaza. This stayed in Canaanite hands. So did Gezer. Gezer was one of those cities that was not conquered, was not taken, even though militarily there was nobody that could oppose them. They wouldn't do it. And like we said, one of the excuses was they had chariots of iron.
Which probably came from Egypt.
Yeah. Okay, so again, there's Israel. There's what the Hebrews actually did. This is what they were supposed to do. So here's our conclusion, and we're right on time. Unbeatable military might and success did not equal obedience. Those pagan nation populations left within the territory of the promised land did exactly what God told the Hebrews they would do. Poison, poison, poison. They were a constant thorn in the side of anything or anyone that appeared to be a unifying force for the Israelites. All right. Let's open it up.